remarks. Those would be very welcome. But I'm also happy to discuss, the situation in Israel, the war. And I'm sure you're all following it very closely. I've been following it very closely. I write about this as well. And so I'm happy to take the Q&A in whatever direction you would like to go. Um, as we know, it's an extraordinary, difficult time. I just before I start, I just want to highlight the importance of what we're doing. And maybe I'll do it by saying this. In the 1948 war, I'm going to mention that, of course, Israel's War of Independence 75 years ago, American Jews and well-wishers who weren't American Jews were really crucial in a positive outcome for Israel. There's, of course, the rallying for rallying public support, financial contributions, and also direct contributions in the war effort. There's this astonishing fact that over 50% of the pilots who flew in the nascent Israeli Air Force in 1948 were Americans. Had been in the U.S. Air Force in World War II and helped form the core of the Israeli Air Force, which became so crucial for survival and then flourishing of the state. And I think that's an important example for us now as Israel faces its greatest test in 50 years at least. So contributions at the practical level, extremely important, but also I would say intellectual contributions, thinking about Israel, studying about Israel's past, its present, its future, reading books, all essential because of course we know that before we can act well, we need to think, we need to align our priorities, we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing here? Why are we fighting? We know that we're fighting. We know we're in this sort of epic war at the moment. But we also, especially those of us who have leisure or are not on the front lines, we need to spend a little time thinking about what's our purpose? Why are we fighting? Why are we not packing it in? Why are we committed to a nation state for the Jewish people? So that's what I want. That's what I want to do with you guys today. I want to reflect on those questions, and really, I'm going to talk about some history of Israel's founding in 1948. But I really want to reflect on the principles of Israel's Declaration of Independence one reason, because I think it will help us today to think about precisely that question: why are we fighting? What are we doing here? Why are we committed to this project? Why do we care? Why do we intuitively, no matter how much we know about Israel, why do we intuitively realize something big, something important is happening here? So that's what I'd like to do. I will, I'm going to speak for about 35 to 45 minutes, somewhere around then. If you have an urgent question, I think that's related to some clarification question, you can put that in the chat or just interrupt. If you have longer, reflection, remark, a question that sums up all your thoughts, we'll save that for the end. So, what was Israel's Declaration of Independence? This was delivered by David Ben-Gurion, the nation's main founding father. Sort of combines, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, all in one on May 14th, 1948, 75 years ago, proclaiming the first Jewish state in nearly 2,000 years, and creating, launching the Jewish people into a new situation in world history. We had been stateless since the fall of the Judean kingdom in the 2nd century CE, 133 in the Common Era AD, and we had been in a situation of statelessness until 1948. And what Ben Gurion does is he transforms our situation, proclaims Israel's statehood from a small museum in the center of Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, now called the National Museum, currently under reconstruction. And he does so in this situation of tremendous national emergency. Ben Gurion had good intelligence that the minute the British left, the British had ruled Mandate Palestine since 1917, having conquered it from the Turkish Empire, the Ottomans. They were leaving May 15th, May 15th at midnight. That as soon as this happened, there'd be a coordinated invasion by the surrounding Arab powers. the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Syrians, and token help from some other Arab countries. And he knew that this challenge was going to be immense. In the few days leading up to independence, Yigal Yadin, the Jewish community in Palestine's chief of staff of the army, he said, "Oh, our chances of survival here are 50-50." This was, he said, in a private meeting. So it was a grave emergency, and there was no clear sense that the Jews would be able to prevail, and all minds were focused on that. What's called the War of Independence had been going on since November 1947. November 1947, the United Nations decides, the British having announced their determination to withdraw from Palestine, to leave the British mandate. They turn it over to the UN, and the UN decides on a Jewish state, an Arab state, and an international Jerusalem in the lands of British Mandate Palestine. That's accepted by the Jewish leadership with some regret, because they felt, oh, this is a small territory, we're not going to be able to defend ourselves. But fundamentally, they accepted it, and rejected out of hand by the leaders of the Arab community of Palestine, as well as by the surrounding Arab states. The war begins. The first stage of the war, up until May 14th, is basically fighting between the Jews in Palestine against the Arabs in Palestine. Is sort of the local stage of the conflict. And then after May 14th, what Ben Gurion had as intelligence turned out to be right. The Egyptians invade, the Jordanians invade the Syrians, and it becomes this bloody battle. Israel does survive. The war lasts through the first half of 1949, and Israel just barely hangs on, having lost 1% of the population to casualties. Right, the Jewish population at independence was around 650,000 Jews, and there dead were about over 6,000 dead in the war, many more wounded. So the price was grievous, but Israel does succeed. So in the midst of this, naturally, Ben Gurion was focused as the leader, Israel's first prime minister. He's focused on the war, but he also had to take this opportunity to say something about the nature of the Jewish state. What kind of a state would it be? What would its principles be? What would it aspire to hold? What was the reason for the Jews just gathering here after so many years of exile? How did the Zionist movement bring the Jews to this moment where they could declare independence? So that had to be dealt with also. And what this book does, Israel's Declaration of Independence, as Bruce was kind enough to mention, is it tells this extraordinary story of how in the spring of 1948, what were the political decisions at the level of statesmanship, but also the decisions at the level of ideas that these founders of Israel's made in terms of shaping the character of the state, of bringing the state to independence, the diplomatic and military decisions, and then deciding what kind of state will it be. How are we going to combine a Jewish, the Jewish character of a state with a democratic character? What are we going to say about rights? What are we going to say about Zionism? What are we going to say about our responsibilities to other nations? And over the course of the spring of 1948, there's this extraordinary debate between the leaders of the Zionist movement on all of these issues. What are we going to say about ourselves when the British leave Palestine on May 14th, 1948? So basically, I've done this talk a few times, and I've been told I think it's good advice to don't bury the lead, state your principles up front. So I'm just going to state what I think the core teaching of Israel's Declaration of Independence is, namely, what vision for Israel does it express? And it expresses the following. It says the Jewish state, Israel, is to be a strong sovereign state, an independent state, fully dependent on itself, not relying on the UN. It's going to have an alliance with other countries, perhaps, but is fully independent and sovereign. That's principle one. Principle two is that it's to be a Jewish state pluralistically defined, i.e., it's going to represent the aspirations of Jewish history and Jewish ideas without being a state of Jewish law. So Jewish state, capaciously or pluralistically defined. That's principle two. And then principle three, it's going to be a liberal state. Small L liberal, a state of rights where the equal individual rights and natural rights of all human beings is going to be protected. So that's really the vision of Israel's Declaration of Independence: a strong state, a Jewish state, and a free or liberal state. And what the text of Israel's declaration does is it calls on Israelis to try to harmonize those aspects. Let's have our liberal side reinforce our Jewish side. Let's have our Jewish side strengthen our liberal side. So it's quite a remarkable document, and it's been in the spotlight in Israel over the last few years because I think it's the statement from Israel's founding period which expresses, fundamental vision of what the state ought to be. It's really the only document in that sense. So it's no accident when Israelis are trying to figure out who are we, what are we doing here, that they're increasingly turning to the Declaration of Independence. So let me go into some more details on that, but maybe I'll just give you a few biographical remarks about this, how I came to this study. So I'm a native of Canada. Grew up fascinated by Israel. Was raised in labor Zionist schools, Jewish day school. I always was so interested in the topic. And then I was able to spend a couple of years at the Hebrew University during grad school in Jerusalem, a very formative experience. But then finally got my PhD in the UK and worked on the rise of democracy, French political thought, actually of all things in 19th century France. But always at the back of my mind, I had an inkling that just as Alexis de Tocqueville and some great foreigners had discovered the essence of the United States in the 19th century and the 20th century and written these incredible books. My interest would be to take what I learned from studying democracy and the nature of democracy and look at Israel and go back to the founding of Israel and try to shed new light on Israel's founding. Because actually, Israelis hadn't really, I said, people have been focused on the Declaration of Independence. Israelis actually weren't so interested in their founding moment as a founding until recently. And it's kind of an interesting subject, right? I mean, Israel is a young country, just as we know, celebrated 75th anniversary this year. And so if you were sort of interested in what the founders were doing, you were trying to think about, oh, why are we here? It wasn't really in the distant past, right? Ben Gurion died in 1973, but his number one assistant and his protege Shimon Peres just died a few years ago. So if you're interested in this, you sort of you could ask him, right? You find Shimon, what were they thinking in 1948? Now that generation has sort of passed on, and so we're left with texts, we're left with history, we're left with all these these documents to try to figure out what the Jews who founded Israel were trying to do in founding the state. So I got really interested in that. And then there was this process, this extraordinary story. So most of the documents related to the founding of Israel were highly classified until the 1990s and early 2000s, because a lot of it was still very sensitive, right? A lot of it deals not only with issues I'm most interested, issues of political theory, principles, debates on what the state ought to be. They concerned also military matters, relation with the Arab community, all these significant topics, highly classified stuff. So as I was in grad school in the 2000s, the new material was released. New material was released, and particular, the most interesting thing for this course of study, the first draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence was discovered in the early 2000s. It had been locked away in a vault, and the story of this first draft opened the door for really a new understanding of how Israel came to be. So let me mention this first draft. So the first draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence was written by a young lawyer named Mordechai Baham, a 33-year-old lawyer based in Tel Aviv, with the help of an American conservative rabbi. And it's an extraordinary story, and what these two guys did, very low on the totem pole, not at all related to the leadership, the Zionist leadership, the Zionist executive. But basically, in mid-April 1948, these two guys in Tel Aviv write a Declaration of Independence, which copies America's Declaration of Independence, basically. And it's extraordinary sense. We like to think, I think in this room, all of us have some thoughts. What do America and Israel share? It's a very interesting question. How do they differ? Clearly, they differ in many significant ways, but maybe they share certain things at the level of ideas or principles as well. There was this remarkable attempt by these two guys to really take the principles of the American founding and sort of translate them and make them into make them accessible and bring them to the founding of Israel in 1948. So let me talk about how that happened. So as I said, this guy Mordechai Baham, he's working for the future Justice Ministry of the state in late April 1948. Not connected to just a young man basically. And the future Justice Minister of the state, a guy called Pinchas Rosen, who's known at the time as Felix Rosenbluth, he's very busy in the spring of 1948. I said the British are leaving. They've got all kinds of things they need to take care of in advance of independence in mid-May. And he's got to write laws on immigration. He's got to deal with all these pressing pressing questions in preparation for the state. But he also realizes, oh, Declaration of Independence. We need to say something when the British leave. When we have an opportunity to be free of British rule. So in the first instance, like any good bureaucrat, he delegates this to the lowest point on the totem pole within the Zionist bureaucracy, and it's this guy Mordechai Baham. So he gets an assignment. It's Saturday, April 24th, 1948. And it happens to be Passover, and he's sitting in Tel Aviv with his family. And he confesses he got this top secret assignment from his boss the day before. I said, "Oh, go write me a Declaration of Independence." And he's like, oh, what this is, he's kind of, he's amazed and horrified and, bewitched and bewildered. He has no idea what to do. And one of his family members, however, suggests that there's this learned American rabbi who lives around the corner in Tel Aviv. Maybe he could help out. So what happens, and a lot of this story is actually based, it deserves to, just as we have, stories of the, shtetl in the, 19th century and so on, I maintain that this story, deserves to enter the annals of great Jewish stories. He goes over to this rabbi's house around the corner in Tel Aviv, and that's Rabbi Harry Davidovitz. He's a 61-year-old at the time. He had immigrated to Tel Aviv in the 1930s, and he was kind of this extraordinary character. We don't know that much about him, but he wasn't a practicing rabbi. He had been trained in a religious yeshiva, religious schooling, but at a certain point in his life, he devoted himself to translating Shakespeare into Hebrew, studying medieval philosophy. He was this kind of fascinating character. His wife was a first theater critic of the Jerusalem Post, then known as the Palestine Post. So this kind of interesting bohemian couple living in Tel Aviv. And so what the two of them do this afternoon is produce a Declaration of Independence, which basically copies the American Declaration of Independence, which takes Jefferson's, invocation of, the purposes of government being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the natural, speaking of the natural rights of individuals, speaking of the universal characteristic of human dignity. It takes that. It takes a few lines as well from the King James Bible. Funnily, for a Jewish state, the Rabbi Davidovitz relies on the Protestant English, the King James Bible. Speaks of God's promise to the children of Israel, and together they write this kind of extraordinary Declaration of Independence. I like to say, as we speak sometimes of in our university of Western civilization being blend of Athens, philosophy of rationalism of ancient Greek, and Jerusalem, biblical religion which comes out of Jerusalem. What these two guys did was they sort of combined Jerusalem and Philadelphia. They combined the principles of 1776, which had served America so well, with an invocation of God's promise to the Jewish people. And it's really an extraordinary document, right? And I think actually, I mentioned these three principles at the outset. I think that what they were trying to do is really express these three principles for what a modern Jewish state ought to be. Because clearly, everyone said, and this actually, sort of as as has come true in Israel, everyone would say that this has got to be a free state. That just like the Americans, just like other democracies in the post World War II era, this state is going to be a state where we speak about the individual rights, right? It's not going to be divine. It's not going to have. We're not going to have divine rights of kings. Um, we're not going to have, or it's not going to be a theocracy. It's going to be a state of rights. So they were very clear on that, borrowing from this rich Anglo-American tradition of the rights of individuals. But on the other hand, they realized that Israel couldn't simply be Newport Beach on the Mediterranean. As amazing as Newport Beach is, and I'm a big fan, it had to say something about Jewish heritage as well. It had to invoke the Jewish tradition in the midst of this, because otherwise, what's the point of her being here? If we're simply a liberal state, there are going to be other places we could go. So what the rabbi and the young lawyer tried to do was try to come up with this harmonization. Let's have liberal principles, protection of individual rights of all people, regardless of religion, regardless of Jewish denominational view, regardless of sex. No, we're going to be we're strongly in favor of rights, but we're also going to invoke and guide ourselves in light of the Jewish ethical tradition and the world of Judaism and the ideas of justice which come out of the Jewish heritage. So this was an extraordinary text. And after this, it's great when I do these talks when the books are in, because in the midst of the book, you see all of the different drafts of the Declaration of Independence, and it's kind of good to follow. But if you look at the books, if you're kind enough to get the book, you can follow this. You can read this extraordinary first draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which I think is actually something which can really help us think about the purpose of the Jewish state today. But what happens historically? Historically, this first draft is roundly rejected. So Baham, he gets this first draft. He writes it in English. He translates it into Hebrew. A few days later, in late April, he goes to the office where he's working, as I said, under the justice minister with a bunch of other young people, and they look at this thing and they say, "This is garbage. What is this?" And what they do is they edit this first draft out of existence, and in place of it, they produce a draft which conforms to labor Zionist principles. Labor Zionism being you could say the founding ideology of the state of Israel. And the new draft, the second draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, expresses that tradition. It talks about the work of the pioneers, the labor of the pioneers, and it's basically silent on the question of the rights of individuals on one hand and the Jewish ethical vision on the other. It simply says, we came here in the late 19th century, we pioneers, we worked the land. This was very important. Our right to be here was subsequently confirmed by all kinds of international precedents, such as the Balfour Declaration, 1917, the United Nations Mandate. All these sorts of things, gave us a legal precedent to do this work. And now we've come here in 1948. So this whole sort of interesting and very capacious vision of for the founding of the state that the first draft had offered basically got whittled away. I won't go to the whole process of what happens with the subsequent drafts, but just to tell a short story. What happens is, so that this labor Zionist sort of track for Israel's Declaration of Independence is carried forward basically until just a few days before independence on May 11th, 1948. To repeat, the British are slated for departure May 14th, when there's a committee meeting of these 13 people. It was called the Moetzet Ha'am, Minhalet Ha'am. 13 people who are essentially the proto-executive for the state, who have to decide on all these key questions of statecraft, these extraordinary life and death matters regarding the war, regarding diplomatic decisions, regarding relations with the United States and the Soviet Union, in light of the British departure from Palestine a few days later. So on May 11th, 1948, there's basically this epic meeting where all the leaders, these 13 people who had been chosen, who had been appointed by all the leaders of world Zionism, they'd gotten together in the spring of 1948 and said, okay, basically we're transferring, power. Beforehand, Zionism had been a global movement and it was to remain so. But basically, we're going to create a proto-government led by David Ben-Gurion, but also having these other people who are going to decide, make the decisions about war and peace, diplomacy, economic matters, et cetera, on the path to independence. So they get together May 11th, May 12th, 1948, and they begin to debate okay, we have this draft of we have some drafts of the Declaration of Independence that the lower bureaucrats have produced. What are we actually going to say when we have to declare independence in a few days? So this leads to this extraordinary debate. And what we do in the book is we trace these minutes. There are minutes which exist, and this is the main primary source from this book. These declassified minutes of like these extraordinary debate between the leaders of the Jewish community, arguing about what to do on the Declaration of Independence and many other matters leading up to independence. These minutes, these protocols, as they call, they read like a movie script. In fact, if any of you good connections in Hollywood, I think it's very important we make a movie on the few days in May before Israel's Declaration of Independence, because it's incredibly riveting, the debates and choices of war and politics that were made. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So May 11th, Moshe Sharet, who writes the second last draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, comes back from Washington. And he had been in Washington, this fellow Moshe Sharet, who was to be Israel's second prime minister. He had been basically the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine's point man, for diplomatic matters in the United States over the course of late 1947 and early 1948. So he flies back to Tel Aviv, and what he reports to his colleagues is that the Americans had soured on the prospect for independence. He had been, America, of course, just like the Soviet Union, had voted for partition at the UN in November 29th, 1947. America had, proudly, accepted the partition plan under, Harry Truman's positive influence. But over the course of 1948, as the war, as I mentioned, between the Jews and Arabs of Palestine got going, there were many second thoughts in Washington. Now, Truman, as far as we know, is remained pretty committed to this, but that wasn't clear at the time to the Jewish leadership, the leadership of what was to be Israel. And Moshe Sharet had been subjected to this extraordinary pressure campaign led by George Marshall, the great war hero, Truman's, the second most powerful person in the United States at the time, had been leading basically a bureaucratic effort within the State Department and bringing in the newly formed CIA, basically using everything he could to defer the prospect of Jewish independence. Now, why did he do this? Marshall wasn't, especially hostile to, Marshall wasn't anti-Semitic or anything like this, but he basically looked at the Middle East through a strict Cold War prism. He thought and he feared that if there's Jewish independence, we won't be able to control this. The Arabs are not going to like it. The Arabs are, going to go over to the Soviet side, and we're going to be dragged into, a world war because of these pesky Jews. So his whole diplomatic action over the course of spring 1948 was to cancel the prospect of independence, and this was something the State Department was pursuing in an ardent way. Tried to backstab Truman at every corner. Truman was in favor of this until it was no longer possible, until America recognized Israel soon after midnight, May 14th, 1948. So Sharet had been there, and so he comes back in these few days in advance of May 14th, saying, "Ooh, guys, this is very dangerous for us. I got an explicit message from Marshall and from everyone else in Washington saying we shouldn't declare independence. We can't do this. It'll be very reckless for us. Who knows what the U.S. is going to do to us if we do try to issue a unilateral declaration of independence. Let's not do this. So what breaks out amongst the colleague, amongst Charette and these 12 other people on this Zionist executive, is this extraordinary debate as to whether and how they should declare independence. And basically, the council breaks down into two camps. On one camp, there's led by Moshe Charette, I just mentioned, who says, okay, we're going to say something. We're no British are leaving, no matter what happens, and we're gonna. He was committed. He was a political Zionist. He wanted there to be a Jewish state eventually, but he was worried about angering the Americans, right? He was worried about losing the support of Washington. And so what he advocated for was a kind of watered down Declaration of Independence, which didn't say, certainly wouldn't say this explicitly, that the Jewish state is completely independent. It would say, okay, we're going to have a two-part process. We're going to declare an independent government on May 14th, 1948, but we're not going to say we're a completely independent and sovereign state. We're going to leave that to, we're going to push that, some months into the future when we can showcase to the powers of the world, to the US, perhaps to the Soviet Union as well, that we're living up to the United Nations mandate, the two-state solution that the United Nations had put forward. Only then will we declare independence. So really, and Charette, as I said, he wrote the penultimate draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, wrote like a sort of quasi declaration of independence. It didn't declare no independence. It didn't say we're not independent, but it also didn't present a forthright declaration of sovereignty. So that was camp one. Camp two was really led by David Ben-Gurion with an assist from Golda Meir, then known as Meyerson, another, the key figures in the story, who would become Israel's fourth prime minister. And Ben-Gurion and Golda said, look, this is ridiculous. This is our moment. We need to fully declare independence. We need to declare a fully sovereign state. If the UN had been able to enforce this two-state solution, as they said, we agreed to that process. We would have followed that process, but that diplomatic process is a dead letter. This is one of these rare opportunities where there's a political void, and we can, in the words of David Ben-Gurion, establish political reality. This is a new political reality. We're in the position of establishing a new state. Golda Meir also made these extraordinary interventions in this debate. She said at one point, look, if we do this, we have to go all the way. We have no choice. We either declare a state or we don't declare a state. There's no time for half measures here. So this was this extraordinary debate. And what happens, as I said, so Charette writes this second last draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, very wishy-washy. Ben-Gurion basically commandeers the process after this extraordinary debate, and this camp wins out. The camp arguing for full sovereignty, a declaration of a full sovereign state, wins out. And in the final draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, he articulates this first principle, as I said, of the Declaration of Independence. Accordingly, this is reading from the 11th paragraph. Accordingly, we, members of the People Council, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Yisrael and of the Zionist movement, are here assembled on the day of the termination of the British mandate over Eretz Yisrael, and by virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael to be known as the State of Israel. So this is really the key paragraph in Israel's Declaration of Independence. And its key statement is that we declare independence by virtue of our natural and historic right. In other words, Ben-Gurion taking over this process and in writing these lines on November 13th, literally hours before the British leave, he takes the side of we're going to be a sovereign state. Just as the Americans in July 1948, produced this Declaration of Independence and say we're fully independent, We have the right to levy taxes, conduct war, make peace, as all independent states have the right to do. That extraordinary statement of sovereignty. We too, the Jews of Palestine, we're going for it at this moment. We're fully independent. We're not relying on the United Nations. That doesn't mean we you won't come up with compromises over land. It doesn't mean we won't, try to make peace later on. In fact, elsewhere in the declaration, they explicitly say we extend a hand of peace to the Arab neighbors, even who are in the midst of even as they were in the midst of a genocidal war against them at the time. No, peace is possible, but we're a sovereign state. We're totally free. We're sovereign. We're independent. And this was a remarkable, as I said at the beginning, this is a remarkable statement. It sounds obvious to American ears. When we say a state, we immediately understand sovereign, but that wasn't clear in the spring of 1948 to the Jews of Palestine. As I said, there was this camp, even in the Zionist executive, who said, we can't declare full independence. We can't declare full sovereignty. Let's sort of allow ourselves to be a protectorate let's call to be a protectorate of the UN in the short term. We see with the benefit of hindsight that was a naive point of view. So Ben Gurion, winning over this position really made this extraordinary contribution here, and articulated a vision of Israel as a sovereign state. And we see this now, right? We've seen it through Israeli history. This view that this principle is sort of so dramatically won out in the Israeli soul and the Israeli spirit, right? We were willing to, when the time was right, we're willing to engage in a peace process. Yes, perhaps we can compromise over land. We'll judge that as a situation allows. But we're doing this as a sovereign state. We're pursuing our own independent policy. We're going to have this strong alliance with the United States, as Israel has had, and God willing, since 1967, and God willing, it will continue into the future. But we're pursuing that alliance not as a subservient, not as a mere client of the United States. No, we're acting as an independent country. And this was an extraordinary achievement, right? That the Jews decide, the Jews of the Middle East decide for the first time, okay, we're launching in history as a sovereign people, as a political people. We're going to take on the moral ambiguities of sovereignty, because when you're alone, you're blamed for what you get the praise for what you do, but you're also blamed, right? You're fighting in a war. People are going to die, and sometimes innocent people, terribly are going to die. So you get the blame for that, but you also accept the responsibilities, the nobility of protecting yourself and perpetuating the Jewish story, and and allowing us to continue on. The lesson of the 20th century was that in order for the Jewish story to carry on, we need a Jewish state, and by accepting sovereignty, we accept responsibility for the continuation of the Jewish story. So that was really principle one, as I said, of these three principles: sovereignty, Jewish sovereign state, and this was again really a creation of David Ben Gurion, really the most important person in this whole story. Principle two, as I said, is, so what else did Ben Gurion do? In the night before independence, he's got to figure out, what does it mean to be a Jewish state, right? And I'm sure we've all thought about that. It sounds easy in a way, right? Oh, what's a Jewish state? A state where there happen to be a lot of Jews, right? And at one level, that's true, but it's also like a pretty hard thing to answer, right? After all, there hadn't been a Jewish state since, as I said, 133 CE, the fall of the Judean kingdom and antiquity. And there hadn't been a Jewish state since Judaism was basically invented as a as a religion of law, of practices, of holidays, of all these things we know of. So it was really actually a hard question. And throughout Israeli history, we've been arguing all the time about this, right? What does it actually mean to be a Jewish state? So Ben Gurion was given absolutely no help by the labor Zionists who preceded him. He had been given help by Mordechai Baham and Harry Davidovich, the young America-inspired first drafters, but he actually never saw that draft. Interesting, when one wonders what might have been had he seen that first American version of Israel's Declaration of Independence. So what he had to do was he had to decide just by himself what he would say about the character of the Jewish state. What did he mean when he said Israel is to be a Jewish state? And what he does is he writes this first paragraph. So let me just read it. This comes from Ben Gurion himself. written around 3 a.m. on May 14th, 1948, with Arab armies about to invade with this existential battle, like an incredible, incredible pressures. He manages to write this paragraph. Quote, Eretz Yisrael was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural treasures of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. So this is quite a remarkable first paragraph. And what I think Ben Gurion is trying to articulate here is that Israel has to somehow, the story of, just the pioneers, the Zionist movement and their arrival in Palestine in the 19th century, that's important. And we've got to mention that as we go along. But our project here can't simply be defined by, blood and soil ties, by our labor, by the work of labor, or just by a simple invocation of tradition. Somehow the ethical heritage of Judaism, which here he says by the book of books, namely the Bible, somehow this is going to inform our purpose. The vision of the Bible, which is not only for the Jewish people, it's said here to be for mankind at large, somehow is going to inform the purpose of the modern Jewish state. It's not going to control the Jewish state. It's clear here that this isn't going to be a state of Jewish law, Jewish halakha, Jewish legal regulations. No, that's not going to control the government. But the Jewish ethical vision is somehow going to be invoked and sort of in our minds orient us towards our purposes here. The Jewish ideas of justice, for instance, and the text will go on to elucidate that, clarify this further. Judaism famously says that in Deuteronomy famously says, oh, there will be one law for you and the stranger that lives amidst you. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt, i.e., Jewish ethics, just Jewish principle of justice, will reinforce our ethical vision for the state where we try to treat all people as equals, right? It's not a state of Jewish supremacy. It's a state where Jewish ideas will have a role, but where we are just, and we're just towards all individuals, not in deviation from our Judaism, but as as an expression of our deepest ethical ideas. So again, I think this is a beautiful vision he articulates here, and it sort of it spreads them, it goes right down the middle between two things which we don't want to do. We don't want to have a state, I think, which is controlled by Jewish law. There are a few people who advocate for that, but it's not even clear what they mean, right? There's no, Jewish law has not really been political in the past, so we don't want that. But on the other hand, it can't simply be, as I said, Newport Beach on the Mediterranean, even though we do like Startup Nation, we like the tech, all these good things that we have. It's got to somehow invoke the Jewish heritage. So he did this in a really fascinating way. One other story about this is that this comes up in the final paragraph of Israel's Declaration of Independence, where they say, I'll just put this, just quote this: placing our trust in the Rock of Israel, we affix our signatures to this proclamation at the session of the Provisional Council, the soil of the homeland in the city of Tel Aviv, on the Sabbath day, the 5th day of ER 5708, 14th May 1948. So this invocation of the Rock of Israel for the name of God. And this is a famous debate that comes up at the time. Rock of Israel is a translation of Tzur Yisrael, if any of you are familiar with that phrase from the Jewish liturgy. And there was a huge debate the night before independence, again presided over by Ben Gurion, between a rabbi, a guy called Rabbi Aryeh Leib Maimon Fishman, and an atheist, a far-left member of the Executive Council, Aaron Sisling, over the inclusion of the name of God in the Declaration of Independence. And Rabbi Maimon said, okay, this is the only clear invocation of the name of God, Rock of Israel. We need more than this. And he advocated for saying, oh, Rock of Israel and his Redeemer, i.e., we need to have like clear invocation of a providential God who is active on our behalf in the text. So there's a rabbinic position. And the atheist said, no, we don't want anything. I don't believe in, why would you force us to say we believe in God in the Declaration of Independence? I'm an atheist. I'm not a traditional believer. So what Ben Gurion did, and I think this again expresses this vision of this first paragraph, he said, look, we're going to keep in Rock of Israel, And Rock of Israel, Tzur Yisrael, is a beautiful term because if you're an atheist or if you're not a traditional believer, you can interpret that in a materialist way. Rock of Israel, i.e., I'm relying on Zionist strength, on the force of the Jewish people, on our history. And if you're more religious, you can interpret it in the way of, oh, a strong God who's intervening on our behalf, who's taken an active role in Jewish history. So that spirit of compromise is sort of a beautiful, this expressed what Ben Gurion was always trying to do on these thorny cultural or religious questions. Find a way where we could think about this in a pluralistic way, right? Where each, the Jews are notorious in this way. We're like, two Jews, three opinions, the old joke. Ben Gurion recognized that and he tried to, express this. So we can have different ways of understanding something while still working towards a, common purpose. So that's religion and state. That's principle two. Finally, I'll say that it was meant to be a state of rights, a state of equal rights for all. And this comes out in this paragraph, which I'll just read you, paragraph 13, the Declaration of Independence. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. So this is really an extraordinary statement, right? One could argue with it in different ways. Actually, this is a paragraph that the so-called liberal camp in Israel is always invoking. And this, if you were following the judicial, we can talk about this if you like, the fight over judicial reform in Israel over the last year. This was a paragraph that's always cited by the so-called liberal camp in Israel, by the Supreme Court and others, and we see why, right? Because it's a clear expression of the rights of individuals, right? Equal rights of sex, for the sexes, protection of religious freedom, religious diversity, rights of conscience, and so on. This text, however, wasn't actually authored. It's not actually an original text. Most of this language was borrowed from the United Nations. Interestingly, the source of this is the United Nations had said in the wake of World War II that any states who want to join the United Nations, in the future, have to have this kind of, this language in it. Which would qualify it, that these are the kind of rights. You have to be a liberal, you have to be a rights protecting state in this sense if you're going to be admitted to the United Nations. So it wasn't actually so original, this paragraph, but I think it does express the vision to a large degree of the founders of the state, right? That we're going to be no one. There were ultimately, so I said there's this Council of 13. Ultimately, there were 37 people who ratified it, and amongst those 37, the proto-parliament of the state, there was a communist, there were like these ultra-Orthodox, there were moderates, there were all kinds of people in that room. They disagreed on every possible matter, but everyone basically agreed that the state of Israel was going to be a state of rights, where individual rights were to be protected, where it wasn't going to be a state of supremacy, where minorities, Arabs, etc., were all to be welcome in this national project. So those are really the three principles, right? And I think it's really it expresses this extraordinary vision, right? A strong sovereign state, a Jewish state, pluralistically or capaciously defined, and a state of rights, a state of individual rights. And the Declaration calls on Israelis and future Jews to have these things reinforce one another. And this is, to me, this is an extraordinary vision. I've been to so many conferences in Israel where people are, bemoaning the fact, oh, we're Jewish on one hand and we're democratic on other. And they look at these often as if these are completely irreconcilable. If you read the Washington Post sometimes or New York Times, it's the same. Like, okay, on one side there's democracy and liberalism, and the other side there's, Judaism, and these, never the twain shall meet. If you study the Declaration of Independence, and if you study the founding vision of Israel, you see that that's not the whole story at all. What they call on is for these two sides of our national soul to reinforce one another, to have the democratic side strengthen the Jewish side, and the Jewish side to strengthen the liberal or democratic side, and that there can be a lot of commonalities between these two things. And I think that's actually really true. As I said, I mentioned one example before. This was something that Ben Gurion didn't write in the Declaration of Independence, but his great rival Menachem Begin, who gave a famous radio address the next day, which expressed his vision of the state, he invoked this line. He said, "Remember, you are a stranger in Egypt. One law exists for you and the stranger who lives amongst you. This is how our state is going to live." I.e., we're going to be liberal as an expression of our Judaism. We're going to protect individual rights of all, whatever your religious belief, whatever your nationality, not as deviation from our religion, but be in fulfillment of our Jewish spirit. So I think that's very important, right? And I think, obviously we're now in the midst of this, great conflict, the biggest since 1973 at least, and we're focused on winning the war. But in the day after, I think there are going to be all kinds of questions which directly relate to these kinds of questions. What are we doing here? What kind of state would we like to have going forward? And to me, the ethical and political vision of for the Jewish state as expressed in the Declaration of Independence really should orient us. It may not be perfect. It may need to be updated in all kinds of ways. But if you ask me, there's no alternative, right? We want to be liberal. We want to respect the rights of all. We want to be we want to have an outstretched arm of generosity to minorities who live amongst us, but we're also very concerned about the perpetuation of the Jewish ethical heritage, to protecting the Jewish people, and that we're willing to fight and die and defend ourselves so that this Jewish story can continue its way through history. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm happy to address any questions about the Declaration, the founding of Israel, or anything in the contemporary crisis that you'd like to discuss. Thank you.
Neil, that was an outstanding discussion. Thank you very much for that. And I know we're going to have a number of questions coming up. Well, maybe you'll start off with the first question. Jack.
So thank you for that discussion, but it occurs to me that a Declaration of Independence is aspirational, right? So you need to have the nuts and bolts. You need to have, the devil's always in the details, and that's where a constitution comes in. And I didn't know this, but my understanding is that Israel doesn't have a constitution. So how do they solve the problem between the Judaism and the law? And because, there's thousands of rules for Jews going back thousands of years. So how do they solve that problem? Is that why they don't have a constitution? Could you clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, amazing question. I'm so glad you asked that. So Ben Gurion didn't say that. So why doesn't Israel have a constitution, which would put nuts and bolts on the principles that I've articulated? Answer: David Ben Gurion, the chief founder of the state, didn't want one, and he did everything over the first few years of the state to cancel the possibility of a constitution, choosing instead, and he only got his way only in part, the British parliamentary model, where there wouldn't be an actual written constitution, but the state would. And this he didn't say, but this really expresses what he wanted to do. Someone asked Churchill in the midst of World War II, "What's our strategy?" And he said, "KBO." Maybe some of you got to keep buggering on, right? That we're not keep buggering on. We're gonna figure it out as we go along. We're gonna improvise, and we're not going to actually specify what it will be. Now, I actually think so. Look, I'm open to the possibility that it was a mistake in 1948, 1949, 1950 for Israel not to draft constitution once the War of Independence was over. In fact, my next book is provisionally called Constitution of Israel. And it's going to, just as this book looks at the drafting process of Israel's Declaration of Independence, this will look into, why, what exactly, how did Ben Gurion do this? Why did he cancel the Constitution? So I'm open to having my mind changed, but I think he was right to do this. And the reason that he gave was as follows. We Jews were a rebellious bunch, and we're so diverse. We're incredibly, as you mentioned in your comment, We have so many different ideas about what it actually means to be a Jewish. That's not a clear answer. No matter how hard we try to figure that out, many Jews are going to have so many different views on that. The diversity in Israel is only going to expand in the coming years. He's expecting, the founders of the state were mostly Ashkenazi, elite, mostly from Russia and Poland, with a small smattering of Germans and Western Europeans. But already by 1949, after they were chased out of Arab lands, that's never discussed, and all these implications of the Nakba, the expulsion of 800,000 Jews from Arab lands through 1949 through the 1950s. We're gonna change dramatically. And so he said that if we try to draft a constitution and sort of formalize in law what now we're sort of working through in a creatively ambiguous way, we're going to put ourselves in a civil war style situation. We're going to have so much culture war. We're going to have conflict amongst ourselves in a way that ultimately will be intolerable. And as he mentioned, and I think this is actually like a very good lesson for the current moment, that these kinds of issues like have a way of distracting you and taking away attention from what he would consider much more substantive, much more important issues. In 1949, when he was trying to cancel constitutional possibility, he said, we've got to focus on immigration. We've got to focus on building up our military strength, building our domestic arms capabilities. If we have a constitutional debate, this is going to embroil the whole country in controversy, and we're not going to focus on the essential, what really matters. And that was I think actually an important lesson. And one reason you could actually argue why this sort of constitutional debate broke out in Israel in recent times, in the last year before the terrible events of October 7th, was for the first time Israelis sort of felt that the national emergency had passed. We're a bit more comfortable here. We're so strong. We're so powerful. So we can, in a way, distract ourselves, consider having a big national debate on a constitution, on a separation of powers, and all these matters. Turns out, I think, tragically, that Ben Gurion's lesson still held. We need to focus on the emergency. Again, I'm open to it. I've seen some constitutional proposals in my inbox over recent times, but I still think the Ben Gurion's logic on the diversity of Israelis is an important one.
Mark?
Yeah, I feel a little awkward because I kind of agree with Jack on the nature of a constitution, perhaps because of the British roots and not growing up with a real constitution. Ben Gurion just missed completely what a constitution was about. It's not a law book. And we see this in the United States, the difference between the federal constitution and the state constitutions. State constitutions go on for miles and try to pin down all kinds of little things. The Constitution is about the big principles. He was creating a homeland for Jews. Say that's principle one, and that's half the Constitution. We're going to be guided by Jewish principles in history. That's also important. We're going to treat people fairly, without regard to lots of things. We also get that. Moses taught us that you have to give women rights to property along with men. So once you start doing that, he could have written a very short document. From what the narrative you presented, Ben Gurion was fighting for independence, but he had no idea the answer to the question, what are you going to do after you win? We keep hearing that question about Gaza. What happens to Gaza after Hamas is destroyed? And, maybe Ben Gurion didn't want to get near that question of what happens to Israel after you get rid of the British.
No, that was a beautifully eloquent remark. But maybe I just say that. I mean, if it's about principles, someone actually you're in very good company, right? One of Israel's most distinguished lawyers had addressed a similar comment to Ben-Gurion in 1950, and his response was, if you're interested in the level of in principles, we have that. The Declaration of Independence expresses the vision of the state to be regarding its ethical, aspirations, regarding the protection of minority rights, regarding the rights of conscience, regarding ingathering of the exiles to which Israel has been devoted. Like, you can't say that has an influence of purpose of Israel, through its history, right? We've gone to the ends of the earth, literally, to rescue Jews who have been in distress. So the Declaration, I think, gets at much of what you would want from a constitution at the level of principles. Are there ambiguities there? I think you're right. And Ben Gurion, in later life, he said he was proud of what he did with the Declaration, but sometimes you could see him expressing second thoughts. Oh, I could have spoken a bit more clearly here. I could have, he sensed that maybe he hadn't, risen to the level of a Madison or, an Alexander Hamilton, in clearly expressing, the principles of Israeli government as the Americans had so eloquently done, for American government. So I take your point, but I think that the Declaration can kind of serve as, if not a constitution, certainly not a constitution, as a constitution, to be a constitution, it has to be able to be amended, but it's kind of preamble to the Constitution. And indeed, Israel's Supreme Court, from very early on, has said that Israel's declaration expresses the basic vision and credo of the state of Israel, i.e., the source of its principles. So we have it. Maybe we need more. I'm open to that, but I think we have we have something to build on in the Declaration of Independence.
So forgive me if these questions are rudimentary questions, but can you? Okay, thank you. So, what is the source of the Jewish ethical principles, and how are these principles different from Christian principles, other than the fact that Christians believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? But if we leave that religious part out of it, how are these ethical principles different?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, and impossible one could say to answer. And for the obvious reason, again, so many, different people will have, so many different starting points even before you get into a discussion of Jewish ethics. Where do you start, right? Do you just start in the long tradition of Jewish interpretation? The question of the Mishnah, the Talmud. There's a whole long, the tradition of Jewish learning, which takes place in, post biblical times. You start there. Do you start from the Bible? Do you start from, principles of Jewish theology in medieval times? There's so many, Judaism is big, rich ethical tradition, and even figuring out where you start can be difficult. What Ben Gurion does, and I think it's again, this is very helpful, is he points to the Bible, right? He points to the Hebrew Bible in particular and says, whatever differences we're going to have about interpretation and the character of our principles and the character of our ethics, it's impossible to dispute that at some level, who we are as Jews, and where it comes from this ethical vision, and the principles of justice, the vision of the equal dignity of human beings, right? Genesis, this beautiful statement in Genesis, could say is a core plank of, and this gets into your comment about Judeo-Christian, the core plank of Western civilization, not simply for the Jews, man created in the image of God, i.e., all human beings are possess dignity, right? This beautiful ethical statement that other traditions in antiquity denied or hadn't discovered, or whatever the case may be, right? That's found in the Hebrew Bible. So if you start there, according to Ben Gurion, you have a strong basis out of which you can build a Jewish ethical vision. And he would say, and I would say also, we can at some level, we expect, whether we want to speak of, Western ethics or Judeo-Christian ethics or whatever, we're once we start going there and once we look into, the ethical heritage of the Hebrew Bible, we're going to find, tremendous amount of commonality with our Christian brothers and sisters, right? Now, in recent times, this phrase Judeo-Christian civilization has been criticized because, of course, as you say, there are tremendous differences between Jews and Christians on substantive matters. But I actually like this phrase, and I think I want to, I'm interested in resuscitating us because it is important, right? We can, as you say, speak of, certain principles of justice, certain principles of ethics, which, well-meaning Jews and Christians ought to share, right? And certainly in the current environment, where we speak, of religion in general, one task for well-meaning Jews and Christians would be to accentuate those commonalities, right? Speak about points in which, the Jewish and Christian ethical heritages, meet or match, right? And it's not going to be perfect. Every two tradition, all ideas, any two ideas are not going to be perfectly aligned with one another. But yes, there are like these huge points of commonality, and Ben Gurion would always, in speaking to the United States or speaking to non-Jewish audiences, would always stress how the Hebrew Bible and its ethics has so much to teach, the whole world, right? And has had great influence on Christian ethics as well, and they're great dialogue to be had between these great traditions, and I believe that as well.
Thank you for again a great presentation, and I may be asking the same question that's already been asked, but I'm going to ask it in a little different way. I'm going to pose two questions. One question is, if the foundation of Judaism is based on individual rights, what happens if the Jewish state, in accepting these rights, now no longer has a majority? In other words, it's either becomes a Christian majority or an Arab majority in regards to what he wrote. Are there protections, or does that address it all? And the second, more fundamental question is: it seems to me that I don't know, that the opportunity when you're writing an initial founding document is to deal with the two biggest problems that whether it's a nation or simply an organization continues to face, and that is, if you have a document that spells out some ideas or some rules, do you take the literal interpretation of that, or do you allow for contextual change as the world changes around you? And addressing that issue is often the stumbling block, as it is in America right now, and in, frankly, Israel right now. And the second question, and I've seen this personally just from a business standpoint, when you're trying to create something new, is it's pretty damn easy to solve problems or have a mechanism to solve problems that you know about. How do you solve those problems that you don't yet know about? And it seems like there's an opportunity in writing a fundamental founding document that is addressed. Is that addressed at all in this document?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. You should have had a seat at the table at this, because you had very astute point. So let me go with your last point first and work my way backwards. As Donald Rumsfeld said, like unknown unknowns, right? Things that come up that you won't even know will be issues at the time of drafting something, right? You can't control the future. And the Americans, I think, with their tremendous prudence in 1787, address this in all kinds of intelligent ways. What's the most obvious example? Article 2, defining the scope and of American executive power. It doesn't say very much, right? It just says the president will be chief executive officer. He's in control of the armed forces and so on. And why is it so important for subsequent American history and subsequent constitutional construction that it's left at that level of generality? Because precisely for the point you mentioned, you can't control the future, right? You don't know at a certain moment what's required of the president. Maybe it's silent Cal Coolidge. You're at a point where the president takes steps back and is not a very activist one, and is understood to have a very minimal role for his task at that historical moment. And another may be Franklin Roosevelt, right? Where you have presidential power in the midst of a war needs to expand dramatically to meet the challenges of the moment. So the American Constitution handled this, I think, in an extraordinary way, right? In spelling out a framework, this process by which you do things. Okay, you have the chief executive, like he's the one who makes commands foreign policy, for instance, but not putting too much substance in there, which would constrain and try to control the future in an undue way. So that was done very intelligently, I think, by the Americans. It's worked out pretty well. What Ben Gurion would say is, you just, for to my mind, you made a case for actually not having a written constitution, because you still have you have elections, you have the processes and principles of parliamentary government, which, by the way, Ben Gurion didn't like the parliamentary system that emerged. He wanted strict British parliamentary system, first past the post, not proportional representation, which is slowly killing is creating a evergreen crisis in Israeli democracy. It's a subject for a separate talk. But so you have those principles, but by not putting too much substance on what you have to do, in a not constraining yourself in a constitutional text or other documents, you leave it to the elected representatives to respond to the moment, the needs of the moment in a ways which are appropriate to them, right? Ben Gurion, again, he couldn't praise Britain too openly. In 1948, Israel again had been living under British rule for 30 years. They weren't the most popular country, but he was a big admirer of Westminster government, which he thought intelligently allowed the representatives, the elected representatives, to respond to national emergencies. So that's your I think that's your second and third point. I think that flexibility, I think, is also found in the founding document, within the Declaration of Independence, which speaks substantively about certain matters. Okay, we're going to have rights of conscience, religion, etc., as the U.S. Bill of Rights does. So there's certain substantive rights there. But at another level, it speaks at a level of generality, which just expresses a general principle. Okay, this ought to be a Jewish state somehow. Jewish ethics are important, but it's not too specific. And it's wisely not so specific, because it allows for people to define what that means to them in different historical moments, and obviously at the level of individuals, right? Some individuals, you're going to interpret that in a thick way. Okay, this Jewish state in which I can and will practice, my life will be filled with Jewish ritual observance, and others who will interpret it differently. So that, I think, was Ben Gurion's way of being Hamiltonian in this sense, right? Combining some invocation of principles, but not filling in too much substance, which would constrain. First point is the question of an Arab majority or non-Jewish majority. That's not addressed within the text, and obviously it's considered to be important. It was a vital task in 1948 for there to be a Jewish majority. Now, one could say that all the good things that one needs for a Jewish state are not necessarily contingent for there to be, if you think of a Jewish state as I do, where like it's the state itself is not controlled by Judaism, there's nothing in theory which says that you can't have like a certain kind of binationalism, as long as it takes two to tango, though. And the sad reality of the Middle East, the case of Lebanon, these other places which have tried to have formal power sharing between ethnic groups, is that this leads to civil war, to ethnic cleansing, and worse, right? So it's actually proven to be the case that having a Jewish state with a clear Jewish minority, with a clear Jewish majority, has been the guarantor of a decent life for people who live within the state of Israel. Not a perfect record, of course. There are all kinds of problems we could cite, but that's been, insofar as there are any freedoms respected anywhere in the Middle East, they've been in a state with a strong Jewish majority.
Hi, I'd like to go back to 48 and talk about did the folks who were at the table consider that they were taking things away from someone? Did they anticipate that they have now created what, an 80-year war? We have people who were there in what was, I guess, Palestine, and they thought that that was theirs, and the Israelis took it away from them and said, go live somewhere else? Did the Israelis, did the people at the table consider what they should give those people to whom they were taking land from?
It's a good question, and again, it'd be impossible to address fully adequately in the time we have. I could recommend some good books on the subject. The short answer is they didn't feel that they were taking away anything from anyone, and they felt that they had a right to what they were getting. And I agree with this. I felt that, not to say there weren't regrettable things that happened in the course of the War of Independence, but I actually agree with this point, right? What happened was so this has been studied by historians from 1948 to the present. There have been so many attempts at revision, but basically the fundamental story that Americans used to be taught and that Israelis were taught is accurate. What happened in 1947? The British, who'd been controlling Palestine, which had Jewish and Arab population, they view the situation. They say these people are not going to live together in a single state. Let's partition the land. We'll create a Jewish state. We'll create an Arab state. We'll create an international Jerusalem, and we're going to hope there's going to be peace between these parties. That's what they do. The United Nations votes on that and accepts a partition plan. The Americans, both sides in the Cold War, in a rare moment of Cold War unity, accept this. The Jewish community of Palestine, as I said, with some regret, because they felt that the borders may not be defensible. In that sense, they accepted. And what happens? The leaders of the Arab community in Palestine and the Arab states launch a genocidal war against the Jewish community. Essentially, again, no amount of revisionist scholarship has changed this original story. Their plan in 1948 was to go in there, wait till the British leave. We're gonna wipe, and what we're gonna do, we're gonna wipe the floor and drive the Jews into the sea. We're gonna take their property. Maybe we'll let a few of them stay once we integrate, these lands within our various kingdoms. And they had different purposes, right? The Jordanians wanted one thing, the Syrians wanted another. Many of the local Arabs within Palestine wanted a different thing. So that is the fundamental fact of this Israeli-Arab conflict, right? The Jews had a right to be there. They came in just as Arab, Palestinian national movement is a new creation. I'm not denying its existence, as some scholars do. It grew up over the course of the 20th century as political Zionism grew up. It became a real thing. The Palestinians were, the people we call the Palestinians were not a player in 1948. They weren't on the scene. It was, the king of Egypt, the king of Jordan, the leader of Syria, and so on. These, some local Arab notables. It wasn't, a Palestinian cause in this sense. And no amount of, so as I say, no amount of scholarship has changed that, that fundamental fact. Was it the case that the local Arabs got a raw deal, but betrayed by their leaders in 1948? I surely think that's the case. But it's clearly what you hear in the newspapers these days. Oh, these are these colonists who are coming in and simply taking land from a well-established population. It's not true. It's just simply not the case.